Looking to break into or advance your career in cybercrime and cybersecurity? Push your career forward with a master's degree in cybercrime and digital investigation from Michigan State University. Experience a nationally ranked program taught by world-renowned researchers and practitioners that can help you play a role in combating cybercrime and advancing justice for victims. Designed to be completed in as little as 2 years and in a flexible online format that can work around your schedule. Visit cj.msu.edu to learn more.
What up, fam? Welcome to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. I am Tom Holt. I'm the director of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training and a professor in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. And I'm here with my excellent co-hosts as always. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Dr. Rachel McNealey. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice and an associate with the center.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Taylor Fisher. I am a postdoc here at Michigan State, and I, too, am an associate with the center.
So, as you all know, when you join us on this podcast, we're here to talk about issues related to cybercrime and cybersecurity and try to talk about things in a way that's approachable and addresses issues that hopefully get things a little better to understand, a little easier to understand, talk about issues that are cutting edge or problematic. And today we're going to have a great guest on to talk with us about some issues that are very unique in the field of criminology and some new areas of study as well. And we'll bring on Dr. Burruss in just a minute. For now, I wanted to lead off with one of our always challenging questions, which is when we talk about cybercrime, we talk about human factors, we talk about the offenders involved, the victim dynamics, we talk a little bit about AI, but do any of you think about robots at all?
I do like to think that there is a little robot behind the computer running everything. That makes me feel better about the future of AI. But certainly, when I think of AI and how it relates to this sort of thinking on its own, it's much more minimal than a robot walking down the street. It's chatbots on a website. It's just basic things that we've probably been using machine learning for a while, and now we just call it AI because it's grown to be part of this larger entity. And so, like I said, I like to believe there's robots involved, but I think what I think of is the more mundane, everyday use of this kind of technology.
I've been really resisting the temptation to be a tech doomer because you never want to be that person in the room. But I kind of have a black hole when it comes to the more sophisticated intelligence and robots, where I am trying to just focus on the human factor until I'm impacted by robots regularly functioning in society, more so than, the little waiter robots that bring your food to your table at some restaurants. But the human factor is, I think, still so important, right? And human-built technology still reflects human behavior. So even when we move into these more automated machines and systems, it's still human at its core,
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm old enough where the first thing that I always think of is like either RoboCop or maybe the Terminator. That's what I think of when I think of robots, but that's largely...
iRobot.
Well, and that's just it. I'm old enough where iRobot didn't have that same impactful impression on me, but that's my own pulp culture age problem more so than anything else. So, in general, yeah, you're right. It's not something that we really touch on, but today's guest who's joining us, I think, can talk a little bit about how robots might be integrated into either our research or, the integration of AI and robots into the broader cybercrime discussion. So let's bring him in. This is Dr. George Burruss. He is a professor and the chair of the School of Criminology at the University of South Florida. George, it's great to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the pleasure of knowing you for a very long time, back when we were grad students, and we've worked together quite a bit. So it's really nice to be able to have you join us on the pod.
Yeah, of course.
So tell us a little bit about how you got into academia.
Sure. My first career, I was a criminal investigator with the Missouri Attorney General's office in consumer fraud. So this was back, before the internet, so early 90s. And, people were defrauded because they would answer an ad in the newspaper, or someone would call them on the phone and try to sell them light bulbs or something like that. And so it was interesting to see, as the internet started to take off, a lot of these frauds and scams just moved online and they became basically scaled up with little investment by the scammers, but the payoffs became much greater. So that got my interest in just kind of white collar crime and fraud. and computer crime at the time was called computer crime, right? Was just one aspect of it. And then, once I finished my PhD at the University of Missouri St. Louis with you, Tom, then my interest, I wanted to come back to that. And it's not easy to get white collar crime data because a lot of that stuff just isn't published. There's only been one major corporate fraud study, and that was done in the late 70s, early 80s. But then as, we became integrated just about everything with computers and networks and social media, then the aspect of, computer crime became what we now call cybercrime because it's all aspects of cyber. So it's just a rich environment to do research. And it just goes back to those early days when I was trying to figure out why people would, become victims of crime and what motivates people to defraud them.
So you were looking at these kind of scams and frauds as the internet entered its heyday. How have they changed but also stayed the same?
Yeah, well, the best example is the Nigerian prince, email fraud, right? So that was actually a letter you would get in the mail, with airmail stamp on it from Nigeria, and kind of bluish paper, and then people would open up and and say, please help me, I need to, take this money out of Nigeria, give me your bank account and I'll give you $10,000 or whatever. And so we would get those letters all the time. People would just send them in and say, hey, this looks like a scam. And we'd respond back, yes, it is a scam. I don't know that anybody that actually fell for it. No one actually said, I sent, $10,000 in and didn't get anything back. And then when you saw it become spam, again, it's just the scale of it became so much that you would think, well, surely no one's going to fall for this because they really didn't fall for it was a letter. But the fact that you could scale this up where millions of people get the email, all you need is less than 0.5% to fall for it, and you've made some money off it. So, and again, the investment now you don't have to send, you don't have to pay for the airmail stamp. Now you just do it with virtually free. So why not invest in that? So that's a good example where it's an old fraud, put in a new envelope and sent off on the internet, but it can net people. People do fall for it.
I certainly think about the evolution of like phishing scams and how even if they started with email, right, as that first sort of type of technology, they've evolved into phone calls and text messages and kind of the same mentality, right? It's we hope that you get enough of these and we've talked about them enough that you're not falling for a smishing scam. But unfortunately, people do because of that wide net approach. And that's certainly an area where technology has allowed that growth and that scale to occur. I can't imagine trying to track a network of offenders with paper mail. That would be, incredibly difficult. But when they're sharing the same Google number or whatever, messaging platform they're using, it's a lot easier to track that. So I'd imagine, like McNealey was saying in the beginning, right, that human factor is always behind it, and the decisions that they make can help us understand it better.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, you think about it this way, it's not just the fact that it's evolved where it's different mechanisms like text messages or email, but the fact that it comes in unrelentless, so that even if you're knowledgeable about phishing attacks like I am, you might get one that just happens to hit at the right time, at the right moment where you're really busy, you're not thinking, and it just happens to tick something that you think, oh yeah, I should respond to this. So I'll give you, there's two phishing scams that almost got me. One was this was maybe 10 years ago. I got an email from a colleague. It said, here's your Excel file data that you asked for. And this was something I was working with, which we traded Excel files all the time. I thought, okay, I'll open this up. I thought, well, wait a minute. So I checked the email. Of course, it was, drx@gmail.edu. So clearly it was a phishing attack. And I went back and emailed the person, said, you didn't send me this. And they said, no, of course not. So again, just because the fact it hit right at the time when we were working together made it, so I don't know if I was spearphished, if someone actually did the research, or they just sent these out to academics all the time and just hope that it hits at the right time. And the second one, which is even more clever, when I was the editor of a journal, I would get a stipend for travel to go to the conference to give my report to the board. And so I'd work through the treasurer. And so I get an email from the treasurer saying, hey, there's a problem with your, travel, open this up and take a look. And I thought, it hit right when I came back from the conference. So it made sense that he would have sent that to me. And once again, the email was wrong. So because it came from a Gmail, like his name and a Gmail account. So I emailed him back. He said, no, that's not me. So in that case, someone clearly knew who he was, who I was, and when to send that. So, it becomes even more as you talk about the human factor, even more pernicious because these people are, really social engineering the emails.
So you've been doing a lot of work lately on PMT. Can you tell us what that is?
Right. So protection motivation theory, or PMT, is a theory that explains why people will or will not take the steps to protect themselves from a threat. And it comes from public health. So it was, goes all the way back to the 70s when they would try to get people to, take better care of themselves in terms of, their diet or exercise, and then whether or not people would, adopt vaccines, or whether they would use condoms to prevent sexually transmitted disease and so on, right? So you have a group of people that are at a risk of some type of harm, and then you try to elevate their sense of that risk so that they'll protect themselves. And so it sounds pretty straightforward. You just give someone a message and saying, hey, look, if you don't stop eating cheeseburgers for lunch every day, you're going to die of a heart attack, and then hope that they take that message. But you have to explain to them, here's the threat in a way they understand it. So if you just say, look, you're at risk, they're probably not going to do anything. But if you say, look, here's your blood count, here's your cholesterol levels, these are all things that are highly elevated and so on, right? So you give them that knowledge, and then tell them the consequences, like, here's what happens if you have a stroke or heart attack. And then they elevate their sense of the consequences of it. And then that should elevate their fear that if I don't do something to protect myself, then these things might happen to me. Then that should motivate them to adopt the behavior. So that's pretty straightforward. But the problem is, on the other side of it is the human side of it that says, well, wait a minute, changing my diet's really kind of a pain. I really do like cheeseburgers every day for lunch. I don't want to give that up. If I try to adopt a more healthy diet, I'll have to invest more in terms of time and energy to do that. It may cost more and so on. So these costs of protecting yourself may outweigh the sense that I have a risk. So a lot of protection motivation research just does just that. It tries to track what people do to try to think about the threats and the response costs, and then figure out what the protection is. So that's motivated then people to look at cyber risk, because it's the same idea, which is, again, we talked about phishing attacks. If I know there's a threat out there, so think about my own situation, right? So I know that there's plenty of people out there trying to scam me to get me to click on something, and I know the risks because I study it. But someone who doesn't may say, well, look, that's not my problem. That's IT. I don't have the time to take the time and effort to do all that. That's some egghead's problem in the IT department. So they just may simply not care, and then they may click indiscriminately on things. And so we try to model that, try to figure out, one, what do people think when they come across these threats, and two, what can we do to motivate them to elevate that so they actually will protect themselves?
That's come up in work that I've been collaborating on, looking at protection motivation theory, is that particularly with cybersecurity strategies, there's a convenience cost there, and that comes into response costs, right? If it's not convenient, easy to do, or seems worth it, people won't do it. And things like two-factor authentication, right, are kind of touted as this is the way we can protect and guard people who aren't supposed to be in a system, but people hate two-factor authentication. They hate having to go between two different machines, put in their password again. So if we have solutions that work really well, but people aren't doing them because they're not convenient, how can the solutions be tailored to that element of human nature, really?
Right. So that's two-factor authentication is a great example, because it really actually kind of is convenient. So when I try to log on, all I have to do is reach about a foot over to grab my phone, open up the phone, press the app, type in the number, and then I'm in. But I hate it, right? And if there was some way for me to hack it to get around it, I would do it, just because it really is as inconvenient, because it happens so often, right? I have to do it at least 3 or 4 times a day. Now I'm protected from doing that, so there is the benefit of it. So that's one thing you have to model then, is what is it about these things that cause people either not to do them, or to avoid them, or to get around them. So that's just part of the research. We have to figure out what that is. And so the problem a lot of times in cybersecurity is somebody comes up with an idea and they think, well, this should work, and then they put it in practice and they make people do it without kind of realizing what the unintended consequences are. So the best example of that is the password, where you have at least 8 characters, numbers, symbols, at least 1 capital letter. And someone said, well, those makes hard passwords to guess, but people hate it because they can't remember the password. So then people get around that by coming up with something that's really easy to guess, even though you've gone through those steps. So it's a good policy to try to protect you, but the response cost is, people just don't want to do it. So there is some element of a technical fix, something that will be convenient, that will protect you, but you do have to take into account how people will respond to it. And that's not just true in cyber, that's true of health and even protecting yourself from street level crime, right? So, it takes a lot of effort to, lock down your home with cameras and locks and, all kinds of, electronic devices to protect it. But, it doesn't mean people are going to adopt that.
I think too, like this conversation goes beyond academia because I know when we were, working through all the phishing stuff, I won't say who, but a very prominent company switched their multi-factor from putting in a number to choosing one of 3 numbers. And I thought, oh, how much more convenient. Now I don't have to type, I just need to click. But really, it's just changing the odds of being successfully hacked, right? It's now I have a 1 in 3 chance of getting through this rather than the 1 through 99 it could have been previously. And so I think for me, when it comes to protection motivation theory, I think about the self-efficacy component, right? How can we convince people that you can do this and you are capable of doing it? Because I'm sure we all have faced this working in cyber. The second you say cyber, people turn off. They're like, computers, nope, not me. I don't know how to do that. And then they don't consider the fact that they're using it every day and they're not protecting themselves every day. And then you have companies trying to make it more convenient, but that makes it more risky. And it's just such an important component, in my opinion, to convincing people that it's not just that this can help you, it's that you are capable of protecting yourself. And it's really not that difficult, like we've been saying.
Right. So there's 2 other aspects of protection motivation that you just brought up. One is self-efficacy, which is, can I do this thing? And then something that's really important is response efficacy. Do I think this is even worth doing it? Right. So if people think, you're just making me do this because you're making me do, you're not telling me why I need to do it. You're just telling me to do 2-factor authentication without explaining to me, 1, what the risks are, but 2, how this actually works, how this actually lowers the risks. And that's a key. So that's one thing we've been doing is testing all these, different ways of protecting yourself, and then asking people, do you think you can do it? Do you think it even works? And if they don't think it works, they're not going to do it, even if the threat is high, right? So all those things. So threat, consequences, self-efficacy, response costs, those are all aspects of protection motivation that have to be considered.
So is this really only a theory that relates to victimization, or is there any way that this might help us understand offender behavior a little bit too?
Sure. So the thing about protection motivation theory is it plugs into what we know as criminologists, which is it's a deterrence model. So the same, put yourself on the offender side. The risk is, if I commit a crime, I might go to prison, right? So that's a threat. You think about how likely is that going to happen? What are the consequences? Do I want to go to prison? Probably not, right? Because it's horrible. But then there's other things that get in the way, which is, well, crime pays, and sometimes it can be fun, right? To commit crime as opposed to working hard to make money. So just like the victim side of it, the offending side of it, again plugs into the deterrence model. So I think it can go both ways, right? So I haven't really seen PMT used on the offender side, but again, if you look at the rational choice models of criminology, that it plugs in exactly. So we did a paper during COVID where we looked at whether or not people followed COVID guidelines, right? So distancing, washing your hands, all that kind of stuff. And we used a rational choice model that is called a modified rational choice model. And as we were collecting the data and we did the analysis, at the same time I was doing PMT, and I thought, wait a minute, this is PMT. It's the same thing, right? So in that case, we're trying to model whether or not people follow the rules for protecting themselves during COVID, but it's virtually the same idea. So I think it applies to just about every aspect of crime, which is the victim side, the offender side, and then also the response side, right? Because in order to make people protect themselves or to get offenders not to engage in the behaviors, you've got to up the messaging, which says, here's a problem, here's the risks, here's the consequences, and here's the ways we can defend ourselves.
I think what I find particularly helpful about PMT too is that it does incorporate that fear component, right? So the theory says that if you're not fearful of something, you're not going to act to protect yourself against it, right? If I don't think I'm going to get shot on the street, then I'm not going to carry a weapon. And so this mentality of like, it is a rational choice theory, but it encompasses the idea that we have emotions related to these things. And if I'm not fearful of something and I'm not worried about it occurring, then I'm not going to act against it. And so when I think about, the smishing attacks that I get on a regular basis, I've learned not to click on them, right? I myself may or may not have fallen for things in the past, but I've learned, right? And so I think, well, I'm not fearful of a smishing attack. I know how to handle it. And so I may not engage in multi-factor with my own personal messaging or whatever app it may be. And so I think that fear component really helps us understand that even when you're not thinking rationally, when you're experiencing something that is scary and, unknown to you, that there is still a rational way about thinking about it. And I think that's where the education comes in, right? If we can help people think through, yes, you can take actions, yes, they're going to be helpful, I think we could help people.
Yeah, that's a good point about the fear component. So Dr. Fisher's probably heard me use this analogy too many times, but I try to explain PMT to people. I say, okay, imagine you go to the beach and, you're worried about shark attacks, because I'm here in Florida. So we hear, Shark Week is every week in Florida. And so you think about the risk, it's probably, pretty low. You hear about shark attacks every so often, but the consequence of being attacked by a shark, even nibbled, is pretty high, right? So it's pretty terrifying when you're in the water to think about that. So when you go to the beach and there's plenty of people in the water, you haven't heard anything about shark attacks, your threat level is really low, you're not going to be particularly scared about it. On the other hand, if you come to the beach and there's a sign saying warning sharks, nobody's in the water, now even if just you don't even have to think about it, you're all of a sudden you're going to feel this threat like, oh my God, if I go in the water, I don't want to get attacked by sharks. So you might not do it. Even if you've invested time and energy to come out to Florida and go swimming with the kids in the water, you're not going to risk it. So that's really an emotional response to it rather than just the thought benefit calculus, right? So the problem with cyber is I think there really isn't really much of a emotional threat to it, right? Or fear reaction, because again, it's just all technology. So what if I click on a link and it installs malware? Yeah, that might cause some problems for my company, but it's not it's not going to be the end of the world, unless you start talking about something like ransomware or other types of attacks that can really devastate. Think about what happens to hospitals when they get hit with a ransomware attack. So you can't elevate that sense of fear that, look, if you do screw up and you click on a link, it can have really bad it can cost millions of dollars. It can threaten the reputation of your company. It can also cost people their lives.
I think too, thinking about protective behavior this way is really useful for understanding why people who might be the most vulnerable aren't taking the most measures necessarily. And I think a good example is like formerly incarcerated individuals who are re-entering society, right? All of their information is in what we've learned are very insecure government systems. But if you've been incarcerated for a long time, you don't know how to implement these security practices. And so you have these people who are at probably very high risk of victimization, but aren't implementing strategies to protect themselves because they don't have the self-efficacy, or if they do, it's just a different world. And that's one example. And I'll give a shout out to Dr. Kaylin Sanders, who's a recently graduated graduate student at MSU who's been doing that work. But I think this model is useful for thinking about that, right? Because it's not always obvious when you're a high risk population for these kind of invisible crimes, I think.
Yeah, so that's one thing we've now focused on is we're turning towards trying to do something about senior citizens and their risks, because if you think about it, we learn about cybersecurity risk because we're at a university, which is an institution that tries to fish us to get us to realize there's a risk, and if we get caught, we get slapped on the wrist and have to go through the training. Which is one way of doing it, right? Just trying to tell people here's what the risks are, and here's what happens if you get caught. And then other people that work, their employers do it, schools do it. Even kids now have cyber education when they're in school. But senior citizens, once they retire, they don't have that same, they don't use technology as much. They start to, lose their sense of the risk of being online, and then they become socially isolated and lonely. So they're going to, if someone reaches out to them, of course they're going to answer the phone when they get called. So that's a population it's a great risk, that has really low self-efficacy and doesn't have the education. So we're trying to think of ways to educate them in ways that will increase their self-efficacy and try to get them to protect themselves, because it's one of the most risky populations out there.
I was gonna say, I think one finding that has been pretty consistent in the work that I've seen of PMT too, particularly looking at individual differences, is the opposite effect of people who are very self-efficacious. Is that the word? Okay.
Yeah, that's it.
I'll go with that. Right, like, and I'll use myself as an example. I was writing a dissertation on falling victim to phishing, and I fell for a phishing attack from the university. So I was that one that got slapped on the hand and had to go take that course because, like you said earlier, I was just at the right time. I was looking for a document. It was an attachment in an email that I didn't recognize, and I clicked on it, and it just so happened. And so I think what we're seeing is when we account for those, internet skill sets, digital skill sets, it's almost like an overconfidence effect where I know I can protect myself. I know that even if I clicked on that, I could take the appropriate actions to protect myself. But I'm not even considering it fearful or as an attack. I just kind of see it as part of my life. And I may be more prone to falling for it simply because I'm not perceiving it as an attack or as fearful. And so I always found that to be a really interesting component to PMT when we were looking at the effect of, are you more aware of technology? Well, that does also impact your relationship with these attack measures.
Right. So we looked at in addition to PMT, when we test that as a model, we also look at other psychological traits or factors that may affect, may moderate the effect of PMT. So one of those is thoughtfully reflective decision making, which is basically just how you think through problems. Do you deliberate? If you have a problem in front of you, do you think through it? Do you go out and find information about how to handle the problem and so on? So if you're a thoughtful decision maker, you're more likely to adopt PMT than if you're not. The other one is low self-control or impulsivity, right? So the more impulsive you are, the less likely you are to follow protection motivation, which isn't surprising, right? Because you only think about the immediate costs, not the long-term consequences of it. So that's certainly understandable. And then also technology skill is kind of, as you said, a double-edged sword. Sometimes it predicts people will be more likely to adopt protection motivation because they're just simply more aware. So it's just a proxy for how much information they have. But it can also be overconfident. So if I think I'm really skillful at computers and networking, then I may think, well, yeah, even if I actually accidentally click on something, I can take care of it. It's not that big a deal. So you become more overconfident. So research shows that that's the case, that you will be more likely to fall victim if you're more overconfident.
I know you do a lot of work with companies and law enforcement agencies. How do they react when you talk about PMT? Does it seem to connect with people, or?
It does, especially cybersecurity companies, because what we're trying to get them to think about is not just the tools, but again the human factor. And one thing you find is when I talk to CISOs or cybersecurity professionals, I don't have to sell them on the human factor. The first thing they'll say is, "Oh yeah, the user's the weakest link," and then I'll say, "Well, what are you doing specifically to address that?" And they're like, "Oh, we have cyber education programs," and I'll say, "Okay, well, what does that entail?" And then they can't really tell you what it's. Just, well, we just give them information. So they're not really. So when you talk about PMT and you tell them what it is, they're like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense," but they're not really applying it. It's not. I don't see it applied it really anywhere. I think that's one thing we want to try to do is get people to think about if you've got a cybersecurity education platform, whether that's phishing attacks or smishing attacks or videos that train people, whatever you're using, apply some theory to it so that you can actually think about the causal mechanisms to get them to change their behavior. For law enforcement, I mean, especially local law enforcement, I don't think they really think about that at all. They're simply responding to crime, and if it's serious enough, they'll get involved. If not, there's really not much they can do about it. So there certainly could be, especially victim services, there could be a platform for them to help in this endeavor to try to train people to protect themselves.
So how would the average person apply a concept like PMT, or how can a listener use this in some way, whether it's talking to their kids or maybe their grandparents or their parents? How would the average person make this work for them?
Yeah, so I mean, probably the most common problem is going to be with adults with their aging parents, right? Because they're at most risk. If anybody has a parent who's past 70, the bane of your existence is getting them back on the internet, or trying to find their passwords they've lost, or reconnecting them or whatever. But that one thing that's important is to explain to them, look, you really need to be careful about answering emails, answering text messages, because people are targeting you to try to steal your money, your information, just to make them understand the risk, and then trying to just make them stop and think about, every time I answer something, is it somebody I know? Is it something I really need to respond to, as opposed to just responding to because it comes through the internet. So you can apply protection motivation, just saying, look, here's the threat. You're at a higher risk, and if you do get scammed, I mean, it can wipe out your savings, right? And that's something that, of course, seniors are very concerned about. And then the hardest part, though, I don't think that's really the hard part. The hard part is the self-efficacy and trying to get them to protect themselves. Because again, even if we talk about the human factor, there's still a technical component. They still have to engage with two-factor authentication or think about passwords. So, I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. When several years ago, the Yahoo got hit with a data breach, and the hacker stole millions of passwords. So I told my dad, I'm like, Dad, look, because at the time he used Yahoo. I said, look, you have to change your Yahoo password, and in fact, you should probably change any other account that you have, just to be safe. And he's like, well, that's easy because I use the same password for all my accounts. I'm like, oh no, and it was like the dog's name or something, right? So I'm like, oh my god. So I had to explain to him, this is a problem. So we need different passwords for every account, especially your financial accounts. So we had a long talk about it. So you can use protection motivation as just a way to think through the problem. So threat, consequences, and then self-efficacy is probably the things I would harp on.
Something that has occurred to me, and I think is kind of a trend on social media that Gen Z is talking about, is how when our generation, like millennials and Gen Z, was young, parents and grandparents were like, the internet is dangerous, don't click on anything on there, don't believe anything you see. And now it's kind of flipped, where older people are really the most susceptible and seem to not have those filters of what not to click on. So it's kind of like, how did we get this generational flip of knowing what to avoid, and how much of that was fear motivated, how much of it now is knowledge motivated about what's out there. But I wonder if just normalization of the internet and it being integrated into everything kind of lowered the perceived threat level for older people. Like, oh, this must be legitimate, so we don't need to worry about it as much. Or is it just convenient, and your threat isn't up as much? I think it's an interesting flip, though.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And then also the one thing that I think is known from studies of seniors is social isolation. So if someone reaches out to you, and in your phone rings, and you're in a retirement home and you haven't talked to people all day long, why not talk to somebody, right? So that's one part that makes it vulnerable. Same thing with when we thought about kids, which was they really have no filter when they're taught to if an adult talks to them, talk back and answer their questions and give them what they want. So it's kind of the same thing, right? So it's probably curvilinear, right? So kids on one end are very vulnerable, and then you get trained to think about these things, and then there's consequences, and then once you get older, then that tails off.
I always think about when I was little, my parents told me don't ever get in a car with a stranger and don't talk to strangers on the internet. And now I use my phone to order a car to come pick me up with a stranger driving it. It's like a really odd instance of you were taught everything not to trust this, and now suddenly you have to because you need a ride to the airport. It's a wild ride. If you guys are okay with that, I want to tie back into AI, because I think this is a really great point to bring us back to that technical point of, and we mentioned it earlier, I think Dr. Burruss dropped the term social engineering, right? This is, I think particularly with elderly individuals and particularly with kids who don't maybe have that perfect social knowledge of the internet and understand that people can lie and people can present as somebody that they're not. But we talk about the use of AI in terms of cybercrime, and I think this is the area we've seen it the most. Maybe it's spear phishing, right? Being able to find information about a person that you would otherwise have to spend hours looking for, or just simply using AI to generate the content that you're interacting with these people. I think the biggest concern that comes to mind is using AI to recreate voices of people that you may know. So you think about your 70-year-old mother getting a phone call saying, hey, your granddaughter is in jail, here she is. And then suddenly it's my voice, and my grandparents are thinking, oh my gosh, Taylor's in jail, I need to help her, right? They would certainly believe that. And so, now I have to try to convince them, right? Like, you can't trust what you hear, right? And it's such a hard thing to do, because you have to be able to first conceptualize that technology can do it that well, right? I think, we think back to the early AI images of Will Smith eating spaghetti, and you're like, that's clearly AI, right? And now it's a perfect implementation of my voice on the phone, and how to differentiate that is so incredibly difficult. And I think AI is just really blown this aspect of phishing, smishing, all of this kind of personalized attack, where now, rather than sending out those wide net attacks that might catch 0.5% of the population it hits, now suddenly I can create these incredibly targeted attacks that have a much higher success rate.
So, in general, George, I'm always impressed with your ability to run really complicated stats and explain things in very simple terms. You're very good at hooking audiences in quickly. I know you're interested in, and kind of building from that last point about AI, doing things with AI. What are you planning to do, or what's kind of your interest in how we can leverage AI for research purposes and otherwise make AI part of the crim research canon?
Right. Well, I mean, so I've been using AI really to go back to protection motivation theory, because I was thinking, as Taylor pointed out, AI is becoming making it's democratizing cybercrime, right? So now you don't need to be a hacker. You don't need to invest the time and effort to learn the skills. You just have AI do it for you. Not only the social engineering, but even writing the code to do whatever you want to do. So I thought there's got to be some way we can use AI for good, right, in this case. So rather than a tool to is like a technical tool to look for digital threats, go back and make it more of a something we can use for protection motivation, especially for again seniors. So the first thought was to do something with a chatbot. So when Chat GPT, with several iterations ago, allowed you to create your own GPT, right? So you could prompt engineer it, so you could create it yourself, tell it what you wanted to do, and then see if it works. So, and then test it. So I did that, and I called it Cybercop GPT just as a test. So I said, here's information about ransomware. Here's information about various cyber threats, and I want you to interact with me as if you're a police officer asking what happened at a crime. And then so I uploaded some documents so it could reference. And then I said, ask me, don't ask me personal information, but ask me, when it happened, where it happened, in terms of just like city or zip code, what were the details, and then tell me what I should do to protect myself. And so so every day I would get up and I would pretend like I was talking to the Cybercop GPT. And so the first week or so, or maybe 2 weeks, it worked just fine, right? It would pull the information from me as I talked to it as a chatbot, and then it would give me a set of here's the things you do to protect yourself. So in the case of, let's say, sextortion or something, right? So don't respond to the extortionist, don't give them money, call the police, and then here's the things you can do. So it's kind of the best practices of ways to protect yourself. And then after a while, it stopped doing what I wanted to do. It just kind of went off on its own. Didn't give any bad information, but it wasn't as good as when it started. So it was clear that creating a GPT just through prompt engineering was not going to work. So I went to some colleagues in information sciences who were developing chatbots for various things, and they were looking for domain experts to say, look, we don't care what the chatbot does. We want to help develop it, and just to see how we can make these things work better. So we got together, and so what we decided was, instead of using ChatGPT, we used a whole bunch of different AI models. So if you don't know, you can go off right now and download all kinds of AIs off the shelf that are basically trained, but then you can program them at a lower level so that you can say, here's the things I want you to do, rather than prompt engineering, but actually do it through the programming language. So that's what we did. So we created a chatbot. I had my students in Cyber Lab, which is my undergraduate research lab, and they came up with like 200 Q&As about cybercrime. And so they went out and they found as much information they could using academic research articles, um, white papers from various cybersecurity companies and law enforcement. So we came up with we thought were the best practices. And we created this sort of all these Q&A documents and then loaded them into the AI. And then we have the AI then, pretend as if you're talking to a senior, and then walks you through, tell me what happened. Okay, this looks like you were the victim of identity theft. Here's the things you can do to protect yourself. Make sure you call the police, and here's why you should do it. And then here's how you can protect yourself. So it starts using protection motivation theory to motivate the person to protect themselves. So it's not just giving. So you could just go to ChatGPT now and say, what can I do to protect myself from cybercrime? It'll go out to the internet and pull out what it's been trained on. But this is different because we're actually training with best practices. And I think this is the way to go because we make it's open source. So we're using open source chatbots, so you know how they're programmed. We're telling you exactly how we train it. It's not using the internet-based training. It's using what we tell it to train on and not to go out beyond that. And we're also telling you, look, we're using protection motivation to motivate people. So it's not that we're manipulating people. We're just trying to push them towards doing the right thing. So far, I mean, that we've done some tests with the AI, and we had coders look at it, and we said, here's 10 different responses from all kinds of different chatbots we use, plus ChatGPT. Rate the ones you think are the best, and they rated it on usability, information that came back. And our chatbot routinely came out as the top rated, and so we have a paper on that coming out. So that's the benefit of using AI is again not just as like a Google search, but actually something that helps motivate you, that a senior citizen can go to and say, look, I think I've been victimized. Here's what happened. I don't know what's going on. And then the chatbot can say, okay, based on what you told me, here's what happened. And then here's how you can protect yourself.
So what do you think would be the best platform for a chatbot like that? Would it be law enforcement web pages? Would it be victim services? Like, how do you think it's best? Because I think the legitimacy behind it is also a component, right? If I find it randomly on the internet, as an elderly person, I may not trust it inherently, but if it's housed on my local police department's website, I might feel better about it. So how do you see it being implemented practically?
Right. So that's one thing I've been doing. I've been going out and talking about this to various law enforcement communities. So I went to the Secret Service as a digital fraud task force and talked to. And so it's not just the Secret Service, but it's local law enforcement and everybody. So I had my little dog and pony show, and we talked about the AI, and then afterwards I'll say, well, how many people think this is a good tool that you would think adopting? And a lot of hands go up, and then I say, well, how many people would actually adopt it? And all the hands go back down. And so then when I talk to him afterwards, I say, well, what's the hesitation? Like, well, we're skeptical of AI. We can't really use any type of technology that will actively take information from the public, right? We don't want that information, which is good, right? That's what they should say. So what we've learned from that is when we create this thing, again, it has to be open and transparent. And we have to tell people it's not going to ask your name, your social security number, your address. It's not going to ask any information. It just wants general trend information. And once we get buy-in from law enforcement, then I think you're exactly right. We need to hang it on the Attorney General's website, because most attorneys general have a fraud division, or governor's office does, or Better Business Bureau or AARP. So we need legitimacy built into this thing because, there's plenty of research that shows that people's use of AI depends on how much they trust it.
So how do you integrate that into your research or interests around robots as well? How do robots fit into all of this?
Right. So a common question as we started developing this thing, and one people ask me is like, well, look, is a senior citizen really going to go and sit down and type and talk to a chatbot, right? So how do we get people actually engaged with this? Which I didn't really have a good answer for. And then one of my colleagues, Dr. Lonnie Hagan, who's a information studies at University of South Florida, she knew people that were had a robotics lab, and so we've created something called the HARC, the Human AI Robotics Consortium. And so they're just like the information science people are interested in chatbots for chatbot's sake. They're interested in how they can make robots more usable in all kinds of domains. So we talked about what we were doing, and they said, well, look, we can import this chatbot to the robot and then have people talk to the robot. And so which is just a different way of talking to, right? So the robot talks back to you, right? So it just responds. But one thing that's really unique is the robot can actually, so a lot of these robots can actually read the features of the person they're talking to through AI and find out if they're stressed, if they're hesitant, if something's, emotionally disturbing them, and the robot can respond that way. So it's more than just, a different vehicle for the AI. It's actually something that interacts with them. And plus there's the novelty of it. So we're gonna test this out coming up probably this summer, which is go to senior centers and just have people talk to the robots that's, again, trained with our AI, and just to see how they interact with them. So we don't know. Are they freaked out by it? Do they, this is crazy? Why am I talking to a robot about cybersecurity? Do they find it interesting? Do they find it intriguing? Do they find it helpful? Right. So we'll go through the whole list of things to try to find out how they react to it. Because if you think about it, very early on, you guys talked about sort of, robots as being kind of science fiction, which, it certainly is. But I think, just like AI, within 10, 15 years, I think robots will be just like Alexa or, Google Assistant in the homes, talking to people. So the robotics lab here at USF has several different robots. One is about the size of a child that can move, it's articulated, can move around. There's the robotic dog, which is kind of cool to watch because it can flip and do all kinds of things. And there's the one we were going to look at, which is really about the size of a watermelon. Its head moves around. It's got this face that has emotive features. And you start talking to it. After a while, you kind of forget you're just talking to this robot. So there's a lot of different ways we can apply this thing. So I think the robots is just one mechanism, to get this people talking to the AI. But again, if you think about in terms of protection motivation theory, if you buy into you're getting this information, you think it's credible and it's also responsive, you're probably more likely going to listen to it than if it's just you typing something in a box on a computer.
Well, I think anecdotally too, thinking about, buying into tech like that, we're seeing more and more people having very meaningful relationships, for lack of a better term, with AI bots, right? They're having romantic or just friendship based relationships where they truly are feeling those emotions that come with just talking to a chatbot. So I think there's certainly an avenue to convince people that this is just as good as talking to your best friend or your partner or whoever it is. It's just like you said, give it a couple of years for people to realize it's not that threat anymore, and we'll be more willing to adopt it, right? I, like you said with Alexa, I know plenty of people have fought it for years and years, but now it's a regular part of my household. And so it's certainly an interesting trend. And I think, at least anecdotally, I've seen people have these sort of relationships that make me think talking to a robot is not that far-fetched. I think people will buy into it. And I think, especially with an elderly population, right, it's going to be an important tool to get to them.
But that also goes back to what when you asked about law enforcement buy-in is, again, I think the most important thing is the open, transparent aspect to it, which is, you have to say right up front, unlike something like ChatGPT, which is pretty much a black box, you have to say, look, this is this is my purpose. This is how I was trained. I'm not collecting any information about you that could be, no names or anything like that. So, because if it just comes off the shelf that some company makes and you don't know where the data is going, that's a real problem. So, if we're to use this thing for cybersecurity, then it has to be done in that way. Otherwise, it's just not going to work.
I think it's a cyber solution for a cyber problem in a way, right? And we know that our traditional solutions and approaches for crime aren't necessarily working, and they're not at the scale that they need to be. So I think creative solutions are that's what we got to be looking at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I think about, I started calling myself a cyber criminologist maybe 5 or 6. I don't know if that's even a thing, but that's when I kind of think of myself that way. And the difference is not just because I study cyber, but I try to think more expansively about how we respond to these things. I think you're exactly right. So again, I think that the future of criminology or cyber criminology is partnering with other disciplines like robotics, like information sciences, big data, and we even have somebody on our team that is from aging studies, right? So, it's one thing to build this chatbot, but if we don't take into account what seniors need, it's not going to work, right? So, in terms of the chatbot just being online, we have to think about the interface. Like, should it be emotive? Should it say, listen, Fred, I'm really sorry to hear about you, losing your life savings. I really want to help you. Or do they just want the facts, right? So you have to think about all those things. And that takes a really interdisciplinary team to do that. So so technology, yes, but also borrowing from lots of different disciplines to make it all work.
So we usually try to end our discussion, at least on this point, on a big takeaway. So what would be one thing that you want people to know, whether it's from your research or stuff that you're currently doing? What's the one thing that you would want people to know and to try to be able to implement in their own lives?
But I would say not so much the individual, because in terms of cybersecurity, things we talked about, protecting yourself, but that comes from sort of the top down, right? So you have to get that information from the experts. So actually turning more towards the institutional level, I think cybersecurity especially has to do a better job of implementing human factor aspects to cybersecurity, because again, they'll say, sure, we understand that the human's the weakest link, but then none of their solutions seem to take that into consideration. So that's what we're trying to do with our research, is to get people to see you need a theoretically motivated, empirically demonstrated tool that works or doesn't work, and then publish that information so people know how to improve it. So Taylor and I have been working on a project with a cybersecurity company where we look at training videos and then have people watch them and then measure PMT and other factors just to see what works and what doesn't work. And then when you actually implement these things in the field, then you would want to use something like a randomized control trial, where some people get the training, some people don't, and then you fish and smish them, see if it works or doesn't work, and then go from there. So we just need a much more scientific approach to cybersecurity than we have right now, because again, it's mostly technology based, which is fine, we need that, but you need to bring in the human factor as well.
That's an excellent point. One other thing, we always talk about education on this show. We talk about the importance of people understanding things. But one thing that we've never done, and I'd like to bring a new segment to the show, just to kind of shock my co-hosts since they're unaware of this, is the Cybercrime quiz. We've never really done anything like this before, but I feel like it's a good opportunity since we're all on Zoom. We're not necessarily together. So to do just a quick quiz. And George, you're one of the best educators I know, really. You are always really good at making sure people understand things. So I thought you'd be a great person to play this with to start. So we'll just open it up, and the first person to say their name will be the person who gets the answer. We'll just do a couple of quick questions. So does everybody feel good?
I'm so excited.
Okay.
All right. So, what was the year that the first federal computer hacking statute was introduced?
1986.
Good job.
Yeah.
How in the world did you get that?
I teach about it. It's the only federal legislation that we have that encompasses computer crime as a whole, with many amendments and fixes since then. But I always ask students when they think that it was passed, and then watch their faces when I tell them 1986. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Nice.
I knew that was it.
I just said 93, but
it's a good year.
Yeah, I feel like this is one of those really good things. We never really talk about the specifics on the show yet, and this, I think, is a great opportunity for us to do so. You're right, that's the first computer hacking law. And it is always amazing when we think about it, because 86, you would assume, our computers are really that big of a thing for the public yet. But yeah.
it was probably motivated by war games, right? The movie War Games.
Sadly, yes, that is a part of it, which is the pop culture of the time influencing behavior. All right, so Rachel, you're on the board with one. All right, so second of three. Second question. What was the first U.S. state to develop a computer crime law?
I'm going to guess California.
That's what I would have said.
Silicon Valley had to be driving that. I'm wrong, clearly.
It was Florida.
Florida?
In 1978, they were arguably the first. Arizona sometimes says it was them, but realistically speaking, Florida was the first. And they developed a law around computer hacking, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I would ask the third, but I imagine nobody's going to get the answer if nobody got number two.
I want to hear it, though.
Yeah.
Can you name the company in Florida that was effectively the reason why they developed a computer crime law?
Say Disney.
IBM.
The Flagler dog track.
Oh,
No.
Not the dog track.
Yes, so Florida was one of those states that had greyhound racing, and
Yeah.
I think there's still one or two places, maybe even in the state, where that's a thing. But yeah, people in the cages, in the betting cages, were using computers to create and print fraudulent winning tickets. And so as a consequence, we need some kind of law around this.
Listen, in the United States of America, you can always rely on legalized vice to drive forward our legislation. That is a constant. Gotta love it.
So, Rachel, I would argue you are the winner of our first ever
Very
cybercrime quiz. So good job.
I'm full of fun facts that only seem to come up in specific scenarios like this.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, George. It was really good to have you on. We've been a longtime friend, so it's great to be able to talk to you in this context, and I hope we can have you back on again soon.
sure, anytime.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us. Hopefully you got some good information out of today's episode, and we look forward to seeing you the next time we cross the firewall. Thanks for listening to the Crossing the Firewall podcast. This is a production of the Center for Cybercrime Investigation and Training in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University, produced by J.J. Thomas. The thoughts and opinions expressed are those of the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the university. If you have a comment or a question about the show, please email us at crossingthefirewall@gmail.com. Also, make sure that you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn for more information. And if you're enjoying us on your favorite podcast app, please make sure that you like the show and leave us a review so that way everybody knows what we're up to. And if you're listening in on YouTube, make sure that you like us and subscribe so that way you're staying up to date on everything that is crossing the firewall.